workshop on the gardens of Dartfloon and linking human and plant relationships and mapping all kinds of stories from farmers and botanists and people around Jordan. And they're going to tell us a little bit about their work, their practice as individuals and together, and then tell us a bit about what you're seeing from the exhibition here.
Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you to Rana and Suha and Dartfloon for inviting us to make work in this space. What we thought we'd do is just briefly introduce you to our individual art practices and the point at which we came together and began collaborating. So this work that we've been doing here is an iteration of, or a development of work we began together in London. But just to give you some context of who we are and how we came to be here, and then we'll talk you through the exhibition and then leave some time for questions, conversation, and also for people to contribute to the exhibition as well. So I primarily work with photography, and this is a work that I made in 2010. It's called Imported Landscapes. It's I've been working really throughout my whole working practice has been thinking about human relationship to landscape and borders and boundaries and the relationship between the global north and the global south. So this was work that I made for Manifesta, European Contemporary Art Biennial. And I made a journey across northern Morocco from Tangier to Algeria, and I made photographs of the built landscape. And then I printed 3 of these photographs and pasted them onto billboards in southern Spain. So it was an installation, a site-specific installation, and then the result was 3 images in a gallery. So thinking about the relationship between these 2 places, I don't know, I think it's on there. Thinking about the relationship between these 2 places, between southern Spain and northern Morocco, and the shared climate, the shared flora, the shared fauna, the ongoing history, the ongoing narrative of trade, colonisation, human mobility across these 2 places, which are now divided by this hard political border. This is an installation image that of Gardening the Suburbs, a work that I first made for McCann Space and which then travelled to London. So this was work that I made over a 4-year period in Palestine, looking at Israeli gardens, Israeli suburban gardens in the Israeli new towns and settlements reaching around Tel Aviv, across the Green Line and into the West Bank. And thinking, if I went from the kind of large-scale monumental landscape here, I was thinking about detail. I was thinking about these small acts that can go undetected, but actually, for me, spending time in Palestine, it was about thinking what different language can I bring to articulating this violent landscape, this landscape that's being occupied and colonised, and the Israeli state attempting to forever change that landscape. So yes, there are the kind of very obvious, the very obvious militarised landscape, but I was more interested in looking at how a military civilian landscape shaping practice happens. And one of the ways that I discovered it was happening was through the construction of what the Israeli state calls quality of life settlements, which are settlements that are built in the West Bank and sold to Israelis as being places that are an easy way to get to Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, a kind of, a safe gated compound that acts like a garden suburb. And I made an installation that also included plants that I discovered had military names. So they have their scientific name, and their English name might be, for example, the Blaze of Glory Rose, or the Winston Churchill Aster, or the the Spitfire lily. So thinking about military and gardening practices going hand in hand. And this is an iteration of the work in the mosaic rooms in London. One thing that we did when we had the installation was to think about how we engage audiences, how you bring people in, how you have discussion, how you have discussion about issues that are very painful for lots of people, very contentious. And one of the things we did was to organise a botanical field trip. So this is a group of people that went out on a bus from here, from Amman, who would not normally access a gallery or be interested in going to a gallery exhibition, but were interested in plants and gardening. And we took them to the Royal Botanic Gardens, and we also did a tour of this neighbourhood and peered over people's fences, and a landscape architect told us what we were seeing, what plants were growing, how much water they needed, where their origins were. And it was a way to sort of activate conversation and also to think about how planting and the choices that we make are not, you know, there's the politics of planting at home, wherever home is. So whether that be in Cardiff, where I also showed the work and did a similar programme, and in London. And then this is the result of that was a book that came out last year. As this process was finishing of making this work, my aunt passed away, and this geranium was handed to me as a result. And this geranium is in my family they called it the mother plant of the red Jan line. So the red Jans are, my grandmother was called Janet. So these geraniums were nicknamed Red Jan, and every year my grandmother would take cuttings from the geraniums and distribute them around the family. She passed away and my aunt took over. 2 years ago I was given this geranium, and it brought up a lot of questions for me about family and the way that I'm sharing and connecting with people. And this geranium was a starting point for a conversation between me and Eva that led to our collaboration. So we'll come back to it, and I'll pass over to Eva for now.
Thank you. So I'm just gonna start with, thank you very much for having us here as well. But I'd like to start showing you a few slides from generally my work, which explores drivers of global migration and displacement. I'm an artist that uses mainly photography, video and sound, and social actions in my work. I work in very participatory ways with different people from different backgrounds. And with drivers of displacement, I mean poverty, which this is a project that, a long-term project that I've done with people who have experienced poverty in their lives. And my projects usually are long-term because they really are based on developing trust with the people that I work with, and it takes time to build collaborations. This is related to trafficking, culture, so the displacement because you come from a particular culture, in this case is Gypsy Roma travelers. Regeneration, a lot of my work is done to explore how people are displaced because new development is taking place that often doesn't really care about people but more about capital. And this is a body of work that I've been making for the past 10 years in an area of London that is considered the biggest regeneration in Europe. It's called Elephant and Castle. And one iteration of this work is called the People's Bureau, which is based in this shopping cart. It's a trader shopping cart that we've customized together with the community there. And it revolves around skill exchange. So people come together to share skills and knowledge, and it works a little bit like Citizens University. This is just kind of an event. We usually have monthly events, and this was dancing, storytelling workshop, but we've had workshops to do with shoemaking, civil writing, counseling for bereavement and loss, screen printing, just about anything you can think of that kind of comes, engages people's skills and the capital they have. And it's also, it brings people together to just spend time. We started this project to strengthen the community in the times of big change, and to bring different groups together, create networks, but also to have a communication with the developers and trying to affect the process. Not stop it, but just how it's going to happen. And so my work takes place in public spaces and in gallery spaces, but I kind of believe in, I feel I'm a communicator, that's my role, that's what I can do, and hopefully by bringing people together, the communication can grow, and it's kind of from just that bottom-up approach that I believe change can happen. We worked together with Coreen. Coreen brought her jams to the People's Bureau and shared cuttings, showed people how to plant from cuttings. And that was kind of one of the very kind of beginnings of the project. But so I also, for me, social relationships, people coming together and being in sharing in kind of public spaces is very important, and the conversations that happen and kind of what happens in the moment. And also what's very important is that there is some sort of object that is created that can kind of almost communicate onwards from that experience, but it also helps people to anchor that experience so they can kind of share it with pride. This was a project where I brought together through a public call a Caribbean community, and it was around, we were using photographic archive that was very colonial from the National Archives, and the group rewrote captions, kind of drawing on their experiences. It was very important that the group came together weekly, and what happened in the space, the kind of sharing, but the output was also a set of dominoes which were playable that incorporated original and new captions, and this was installed in the National Archives and the museum where we worked, and kind of lives on its own life. Similarly to this project that was community project as well, with different groups of people exploring several different issues of displacement, trafficking, migration. But it was installed in gallery spaces, into museums, but also on the public buses, bus stations. And kind of that is, for me, very important that the work find its own way to communicate messages. Like this one, the one on the right is the book that was disseminated free by the people I worked with. It's a book of people's portraits and their stories that people literally were carrying around. And then we also installed it in local businesses as a set of posters and surrounded it with an event that incorporated food tasting, music sharing, poetry, and so on. And here I come to a project that you'll recognize, Mr. Landsner, who is also on that wall there. And this is work I did a couple of years ago, and it was done on the border between Slovenia and Italy. I am Slovenian, so I was commissioned by this visual arts festival in Italy to respond to, again, themes of migration. And my focus was looking at how the border between Italy, how the change, because Yugoslavia broke down in the 90s, and what kind of change that brought to the understanding of people of that border, but also kind of the physicality of it even when it didn't exist, and also how it changed the bringing across goods. So in this case, it's Mr. Landsner in his plant nursery, and the stories that he was telling me around, plants suddenly not being held in a truck on the border for unpredictable amounts of time. Sorry. And this was the starting point of our working together, and the work the first iteration after this that we've done together was installation on an exterior wall of a gallery in London.
So the interior, which we don't actually have an image of, is we had an installation of all my grandmother's plants, which when I did when I was invited to do the skills exchange with People's Bureau, I was thinking about spreading the cuttings of the plants beyond my family, you know, beyond the kind of nuclear family. So I was sharing plant cuttings with whoever was participating, and in return they were sharing with me a story that related to plants, to gardens. And the geraniums were particularly evocative. There's a smell. The geranium has a smell that people either love or hate, but it often triggers childhood memories. So people were giving me their stories. And at the 198 gallery, we had an installation of my grandmother's plants. We traced the stories, we wrote the stories around the space on the walls, and we also bought 1,000 small geranium plug plants from Syngenta, which is one of the biggest plant agricultural plant nurseries in the Netherlands. And we nurtured them in the space. And they travelled with us for a while. So they travelled to the installation that we then did later in a gallery at the University of the Arts London, where we both are affiliated. And we included this, the grid of the red jam. And it was multi-layered, so people could take a section of the image as well. So we're turning over ideas about plant use, human-plant relationships, trade, agriculture, and plants as a sort of a trigger for memory. And we were invited to propose something for the lab, and we'd already been speaking to Elena and Tarana about the garden and making something in response to Darat's garden, which is this sort of treasure in Amman, you know, one of the only publicly accessible green spaces that seems to play such a role in people's imaginations and is deeply felt by the people who work here, but is also, you know, accessed by many of the people living in the city. And so we wanted to use the garden as a starting point to celebrate the garden, to make a map of it, to document the plants in the garden, and then to use that map to extend outwards, to extend back to Europe and the conversations that we started there and the things that we've learned there. I've been working in southern Spain with farmers, with people who are cultivating there.
And it's recognizing the importance of past, but also looking towards the future.
So I think, you know, the most, if my work in Palestine, the most disturbing thing for me was thinking about how Israel uses water as a weapon. It switched me on to thinking about water use in other places and water access and restriction. And alongside that, Emma has been doing a lot of work with thinking about climate change and forced migration that will come or is coming as a result of climate change. So we wanted to bring all of that discussion into this space. So we've spent the last time we were here in October and now this 10-day period kind of working quite intensively, visiting different farmers, permaculture gardens, and also working with people here in the space. Is that better? So we've had, is that much better? I'm actually audible now. Working with a group of participants over 2 weeks who come from very diverse backgrounds, each with their own knowledge that they bring, and looking primarily at the edible plants in Darat's garden and making this map in which we map the edible plants and share knowledge, what we know. Some of it's facts, some of it's folklore, some of it contradicts. You know, you'll find, and I hope people have had the chance to look at the cards, they might corroborate or they might contradict one another. We've colour-coded the cards. We won't get into great detail. If you want to know the coding system, ask us afterwards. But just very briefly, there's the cards, the workshop participants, each colour-coded with the fruits and plants that you see on the map legend. Then anything in brown, people from Darat who took me on garden tours. So the last time I was here, I went on tours with the Darat gardener and some other people. The blue cards are stories, information, narratives that we got from many different farmers that we spoke to, Syrian, Jordanian, Lebanese, Egyptian. And the pink parts are information that we've got from websites, from researchers. We've been working with a particular scientist, and we asked him specifically about Jordanian plants that are grown here and are kind of stable crops, to ask him to predict how these crops might fare in the future, depending on the water and temperature change.
Yeah, so this work draws on thoughts around the connection between people and plants, because people have always been carrying seeds with them, spreading them, but also if plants cannot be grown under certain conditions, if there's climate change, people have to move as well. So it's this constant kind of cycle that we're very interested in. And also this is kind of how we wanted to present the work here. It doesn't have a linear narrative, but we're kind of inviting audience to find their own story through it, because also we are not from here, so it wouldn't be right for us to be telling the story, but it's kind of presenting material that we produced together with also participants during our workshops here. And it's almost, you take what you can take, and the scientific knowledge is there as well to support stories, but stories are usually the ones that engage more and on a more informal level.
And speaking of which, if the people in the front rows just look behind you on this pillar, you will see, behind Dorian, you'll see the pink scientific texts with a blue personal narrative laid on top of it. Because one of the things that came out of the discussion this afternoon was, how much information can you take and what are you supposed to do with this information? It's very difficult to take in this dense information, scientific fact, but actually hearing something through somebody's personal narrative allows it to embed. So this was the response to that, was to lay the personal narrative over. So just to talk you through the space, and I don't know if we want the lights. Do we want the lights on again? Is that possible? Some lights. So our vision with the way that you might encounter the work is you come into the space. Here is Mr. Lansner. He's looking away, but he leads you into the space. He leads you to a water tank, which is from the building opposite, and leads you into the map. So this being the sort of central point, the map of Darrat's garden. The catalyst, yeah. And here we have a series of cyanotypes of edible plants in the garden and other plants that were collected from the garden last week that we make as workshop participants to act as an illustration, to cross-reference with the content in the map. Opposite them on the back wall is a photograph that Ellen made. It's called the white lead tree. So this was a tree. It's a tree from Darrat's garden that Ellen collected.
Yeah, I took away a couple of pieces and used them in the darkroom. I was basically in the color darkroom and using light to paint on photographic paper. And for me, that resonates because we found out that tree nourishes the soil and brings nitrates back into the soil. And reading some of the new research suggests that soil, if we treat it properly, it can become sink for CO2, and it could maybe work in the intermediate period as a kind of slowing down further decline and further climate change.
The material that you see on the plinths are ceramic hosh. I don't know if that's the correct pronunciation. When we were here in October and I spoke to several people about the garden, the hosh tree was the tree that seemed to resonate with most people. When I was having conversations with them, this was the tree that resonated the most for various reasons. And it felt to be one of the most important plants in Darrat's garden. So we used this. We brought back, so the photograph that you see behind us, illuminated, is one of the bitter oranges that I brought back in October and photographed in the studio. We also made clay casts, so we worked with another artist, Shane Morgan, in London. So, do you want to talk through the process?
Yeah, we wanted to make the connection between places, because this koshkash was brought from Israel and was planted in the Rat garden, and we then took the fruits, 6 fruits, we made 6 molds, and we then casted them. So there's one here and one there, these oranges, but we used clay that we collected in the river in London, in the Thames, just to kind of make this, you know, to kind of work with the idea of the circle. And the one here has been fired once, just a little bit about the process. And the one in the other, on the other plinth has been fired twice because it's been glazed. And because of the unpredictability of the material that the technician didn't know, because he normally uses clay that he buys, that one collapsed during the second firing. And for us that was quite interesting because the process itself kind of worked well with the kind of scorching of an orange that would happen perhaps during the warming or weather that's too warm.
We spoke to various farmers who told us, we spoke about sensitive plants. There was a question to all the farmers that we met is what's the most sensitive plant that you have and what's the most temperature sensitive. And so these, you know, all these kind of fragments are here on the cards through the space. And what we did with workshop participants today was come back together, look at all the materials. So we had transcribed everything that had happened in our conversation last week around the table with the workshop group. We transcribed them all, and then today we came back together to look at this material, to look at the material that we gathered from farmers, from scientists, and each and split into groups and had discussions about which cards spoke to others and what was missing and what we wanted to say in response. So you'll see handwritten cards as well.
And we very much wanted this space to be an experimental space, a space of people coming together, an open space where people are invited to have conversations with us and amongst each other, and together produce something that is not the finished product, but that kind of has potential for development.
And just lastly, to your left, these are the clay molds which we brought because when we were thinking about what we wanted to put in the space, they were always very central because they're about the process. They're really about our process of thinking through making in a collaborative way.
And maybe just a few words about the workshop today. It was really, really amazing to come together again. So we had the first workshop last Saturday, we processed the material and then we came together again. And a number of questions that for me resonated strongly came out of this. One was with, you know, what as an individual participant in the workshop, what do I do now? What do I do with the material that I take away with the findings? What are kind of practical actions that I can take? And the other one was the series of kind of suggest solutions that are on the pillar there. That's quite, you can have a look just next to the projection.
Somebody had pulled out a quote that was an organisation saying, urgent action needed for climate, but then it's like, okay, what are we supposed to do with that information? What, you know, and she was sort of saying, yeah, we're in this space looking at these texts and they're frightening, but what do I do? So she's written, what do I do? And then we pulled out some more quotes that were of a more practical nature. But one thing that came out today is thinking that we need to put together at least some kind of share web platforms, share the toolkit. Yeah, maybe we need to provide some sort of toolkit in the space. So what came out of the workshop today were a lot more questions,
and also kind of the legacy. You know, what happens after we're gone? And there's Dina who might want to continue something, but maybe some of you that have been there today want to say something.
Not to put you on the spot.
No. If you don't, you're right.
Sure, I'll say something. So I was really interested in the conversations that took place during the workshop and how as one thing got presented, other people would share stories. So if someone brings up, for example, the bitter orange, then several people have stories of how the bitter orange has been important in their lives. And then today, as we put these up, people began thinking of things that related to things that were up there and writing on them. So for me, I'm just really interested to see if people who come do engage with that material, what they write, and if they continue to have a conversation with it, that their own stories get added in, or their comments and responses get put on top of what that is.
So we invite people. We've got as you come in and you get the introductory text, there are also some cards and some pens and some blue tack. So we're inviting participation. If you disagree with something that's written on the wall, or if you have another narrative, we invite you to include your own knowledge and narratives into the material in the space. And
just a couple of words about what is next. So for us, really important is that this is not a closed project, but it's kind of material that we will take away, share with our colleagues and students at the university, but also that will grow as kind of we gather more research in other places and kind of spread the information and stories. And the other thing is also what happens to the map that we're kind of discussing with Rana, what kind of form it will take, and that perhaps is going to be an online thing to which people can further contribute.
And just finally, one really lovely suggestion that came out of the workshop today was somebody who is part of a collective that has a permaculture garden. And she was suggesting that something similar could be activated in the Darragh Garden. So it's not only a place that people visit, but a place that people can contribute to and have agency and share in the garden as well. So we'll leave it there. If there's any questions, you want to say something?
No, I just wanted to say that I think that what you've done is, what you've done is really, it's sort of really captured what the lab is all about in terms of this like participatory engagement where everybody comes in with their own knowledge and their own bits of information, and it just sort of gets put on there. And for those who want to add their stories, it would be important. And don't feel like, oh, I don't know enough, so I shouldn't, but I'll tell you, like, half of the stuff up there, we don't even know if it's true or not. Some of it is, oral storytelling, rumors, but I think that's the important thing, to capture the stories around the garden and not necessarily like scientific fact about plants, or maybe the intersection of the two. And so I think what you've done and what the workshop participants have done is really the beginning. I mean, it was 2 sessions. I wish it was maybe like 10, but I think that it's a project that should continue to grow. So if anybody has anything, there's a paper on the back, and you can add your own personal stories. And if anybody has a question for Eva and Corinne, we have a bit of time. Or if anybody wants to add anything in the workshop.
I think in the conversation I had with you before, and it's not been highlighted in the talk, is the relationship that the garden has to Jordan, and the relationship how global things change related to the garden and so on. Maybe you can tell something more about stories that touched you, that you discovered during your research here in the last 2 weeks.
Yeah, I think for me very, very interesting was hearing about, from the farmers, for example, hearing about how the water is more abundant, the water in the river Yarmouk is more abundant now because Syria has got a crisis and growing isn't happening. But also how the border suddenly becomes very, very kind of unpermeable because the export can't happen anymore. All the routes for Jordanian export went through Syria into Turkey and further into Europe, and that's now really, strong and present, which also affects farmers and farming to suffer here in Jordan.
really. I mean, yeah, I agree with you. I think it was that contradiction as well, that there's more water available. You know, apparently there's more water available because Syrians can't farm, because there's not production happening, and there is an incredible amount of waste because the border's closed. And this,
I mean, the other thing that was that's kind of for me very present is how visible colonization is. You know? Because now, for example, what's going on in terms of the nature being colonized by the human, that's something that's not very visible. It's something that just is there, but it's much more difficult to put your finger on. And that kind of, for me, comes out of our research here as well. It's a very subtle kind of way of, but you know, you can dig and really see it. It's not anymore so present, yeah, in terms of visibility.
yeah. But there, you know, from Mr. Lansner and us buying the plants from Syngenta, and the farmers here who buy all their seeds from the same multinational corporations. Yeah.
And also, you know, the fragility of the human. So the fragility in terms of we kind of respond to the forces, the global forces. We buy, you know, farmers, I'm sure everyone buys seeds from certain places. And here in Jordan, what we were told is mainly seeds are bought in Europe and in the USA. So the plants, the crops that are grown are hybrids, which means that every year the farmers need to buy seeds again to replant. They don't cultivate seeds themselves, only for certain crops. For example, he was saying beans and sometimes cucumbers. So if anything was to happen that broke down this kind of global the networks, you know, it's kind of quite scary to think about that the fragility, you know, something that we feel is so, and particularly at this time, at this present moment, you know, what's happening on global level, it's kind of quite scary to think about that all these things can kind of, you know, Trump comes, can just disappear, everything that's been built for a long time. To me, that was kind of, a way of thinking about those things.
And I mean, just say again that I invite you to spend some time and read the text, because all of this is fed through. I think you did a very nice thing today, which was making a connection and thinking about connections between the map and the water tank, and the text that you chose to put there to build a bridge between the two was very important, and was what is what we're trying to do here, is to build, you know, threads of connection from the local to the global, and, you know,
from outside the rat to inside, to connect. Does that answer?
Yes.
It's kind of a little bit inarticulate, but I hope.
To see it bigger than
It's quite difficult to talk about these issues because it's so complex and multi-layered, and even today in the workshop it took 2 hours to actually get to discuss different things. It's not a simple linear kind of narrative that one can say, and it's always can evolve. So yeah. But thank you for the question. Very important question.
Anybody else? Questions? Okay, well, thank you very much.